Hello everyone, my name is Jeff Montag and I'm the Director of Projects Finance at NGen. Today I will be walking you through the information on the funding process, eligibility of project expenses, and the claims portal. This information can also be found on our website. The objective of this presentation is to help you understand and navigate the funding rules, make it as easy as possible to obtain funding quickly, making the process as smooth as possible, answer any questions up front, and to prepare your company and NGen for any future audits and adjustments by the federal government. Just a reminder, this isn't a granting program, it's a reimbursement model. Funding is provided based on direct, supportable, and eligible project costs. You will have a project budget that is outlined in the Master Project Agreement, or MPA, and your costs will need to fit within those defined budgets or a recorded approved change request. So just to speak a little bit to the financial due diligence process. This is something that we require all project companies to do. The lead will need to secure permission and consent from all partners for financial due diligence and confirm that to us by clicking the Agree to Financial Due Diligence checkbox in the application. It's highly confidential as we're often dealing with sole proprietorships. Each partner company, not just the lead, will submit their information directly to NGen through our secure portal. It will take some time for us to be able to go through this process and review submitted documentation and financials, and this is something that we do require to be completed before projects move into assessment. So please be diligent on getting your documentation submitted once you pass screening. We require all financial due diligence documentation to be provided to NGen within 1 week following the screening deadline. Earlier is better, and we will use the subsequent weeks for NGen feedback to request further information if required. Starting with the application process, the first step of the financial review is the financial due diligence. The reason this is required is that we know each partner is going to be making a financial commitment to be able to complete the project, and we need to confirm that they have the financial wherewithal to support themselves and the full scope of the project through the project duration. Once we receive your financial supporting documents, NGen Finance will complete some industry standard analysis at a minimum, with other analysis as needed in order to ensure that each partner will be able to support themselves in the project through the full term. We need to be sure that each company will be able to follow through on its commitments so they can deliver a result to the consortium. In order to submit the required financial documents, once the project has passed through initial screening, you'll need to log into the portal, navigate to the URL you see here, and sign into the portal. Once logged in, select Project from the menu and choose your specific project from the list. When the project is in the application development stage, indicated by the big blue chevron at the top, you should see a list of menu options that includes financials, as shown here. Then scroll down until you see the financial due diligence section. On this screen, you can load your financial statements and cash flow forecasts, as well as any other support we may request through the process. Once the finance team have reviewed, we may come back with questions, or if everything we need is provided and acceptable, we'll approve it and you'll be notified. So just to speak a little about the project financial planning process. Reading and well understanding the guides, what's eligible and what's not, will help you avoid an embarrassing situation with your leadership because they have a different expectation on what they can be reimbursed for than what we will allow. For example, when you would typically use a fully burdened engineering overhead rate, but we can only accept straight labor and statutory benefits, there's an enormous difference there. Understand that this is meant to be a collaborative Canadian initiative. Projects that wish to hire offshore labor to minimize costs will be forced to prove that this function or effort cannot be acquired from resources within our borders. Costs, particularly labor, are expected to be incurred in Canada, and if that's not completely possible, in other words, it doesn't exist in Canada, there is a way to get an exception, but it's a rigorous process. We have several limits, as you can see, on what % of the project can be subcontracted or capital, for example. All of these limits are in the guide and will be laid out further in the presentation. As I mentioned, once you understand what's eligible and what's not, and it's clearly conveyed to your senior management, Then you can properly put together the finance plan for your project. You'll be working with your engineers and senior management to create the budget. Our finance workbooks and forecasts are embedded in our portal, so you'll want to keep your own backup for how you populated the budget. Identify in your budget which items are reimbursable by us and put them into the finance workbook on the portal. Next, put some words around the numbers. Tying a piece of equipment or an individual to a specific work package or explaining the tie-in from the expense to your project plan will help the assessors make sense of your budget. Then remember, this is a budget. What's more, it's development work. You don't know what you don't know, and as you work through your project, you'll sure to change direction. That's okay. There are mechanisms called a project change request or PCR to move funds around within our limits and within your budget cap. Claims approval goes much more smoothly when our claims team can follow your claim back to the budget line item. So being detailed in your budget or PCR will make the claims process more quickly as well. The project is meant to be collaborative. Some of the evidence we expect to see to support the collaborative nature is a split of the cost between partners. We require that all partners have skin in the game because we know that a common objective with partners that have a financial stake will provide synergies one company can't get on its own and provide growth opportunities to a wider base. Now we'll talk a bit about what expenses can be claimed. Do note this is a general summary. Please refer to your finance contact or the guide for specific eligibility. The types of costs that are eligible for NGen funding are defined by ISED funding rules. So they're not just our rules. This program will fund 37% of eligible expenses with no single project participant receiving more than 70% of the project funding. Basically, if you're a company incorporated in Canada, whether for-profit or not-for-profit funded by industry, and you're an NGen member, you're eligible. Generally, expenses must be new to the business, or additional, reasonable, and directly relate to eligible activities within the project. Remember the term additional as it will surface a couple of more times through this discussion. That generally means that the cost is not part of your normal business. You would not have incurred this cost at this time in this magnitude if not for the project. In-kind costs are not reimbursable and no overhead costs are allowed. Claims must be done on a cash basis, meaning only expenses that you have incurred and actually paid may be claimed within the project period. Expenses must be submitted net of any sales tax. Claimed salary and wages costs must reflect the labor you have incurred, so hourly rates you are reporting must tie back to payroll registers. Timesheets and payroll registers will be required to support the hours claimed towards the NGen project and should indicate the activities contributed towards the project. Labor costs must be reasonable to the activity being performed. You can't claim a labor rate of $200 per hour to perform a task with a market rate of $50 per hour. Only claim non-discretionary benefits. CPP, EI, EHT are eligible and these should be prorated to the hours worked on the project. No discretionary benefits or pension can be claimed. Costs for routine administration are ineligible, but administration of project activities is allowed if you can provide reasonable support in the form of timesheets. Labor and subcontract costs are expected to be incurred in Canada, and if that's not completely possible, in other words, it doesn't exist in Canada, there is a way to get an exception, but it's a rigorous process. As you can see, there is a limit on the total amount of subcontracted costs that can be covered in the project. This is a project-based limit, not an individual company limit, so you could have one company with higher than 30% of their costs as subcontracted, as long as another company has less. Project participants cannot be a subcontract to another partner when it comes to labor. Subcontract must be reasonable to the task being performed and accounted for at fair market value. You can refer to the CRA definition of related companies on this slide once it's available online. Labor and subcontract costs are expected to be incurred in Canada. Once again, and if that's not completely possible, and it doesn't exist in Canada, there's a way to get an exception. NGen funds up to 100% of the acquisition of new, as in new to you, equipment and cannot exceed 25% of the total project costs. Used equipment is eligible. Cash payments towards equipment under financing arrangements are eligible to the extent paid during the project term, but this excludes interest. So here we're talking about The principal portion of the lease, not the interest. If you lease an asset, will contribute during the project period, after which it's on your account. Therefore, to make the most out of your funding, you'd be best to purchase the equipment outright, borrow if needed, rather than taking up a lease. Again, the interest portion of the loan would not be eligible, but we would pay the reimbursement rate on the total cost of the asset. Any existing equipment that you are using to carry out project activities cannot be claimed. Remember, we're looking for additional spend, so it has to be purchased after your project has been approved. However, you can claim direct costs incurred to run the existing equipment, so materials consumed and utilities costs if they're metered. If there is any single asset that you're buying over $1 million, that requires pre-approval from NGen. So get in touch with us first if that's in your project. Now, when we say single asset, you need to include the cost of getting that asset into service. If you have a press worth $950,000 and you need electrical wiring of $60,000 and rigging of $25,000, then you're over $1 million to put that into service, and you need to get it pre-approved. You are allowed to purchase equipment from foreign sources without pre-approval, assuming it's under $1 million. Materials consumed in development quantities are eligible for reimbursement. Be careful, not production levels of material. If a partner wants to sell material to another partner within the project, it must be done at cost, supported with purchase invoices from the third-party vendor. If, through your development process, you are producing samples resulting in off-fall or scrap that has significant resale value, the expectation is that this charge will be net of scrap. This is the sort of cost that can be reviewed by the Auditor General, so it's important that you maintain your record keeping. For travel costs, the National Joint Council Travel Directive is the base guideline. Costs are required to support project activities. Familiarize yourself with the directive if you haven't already, but understand the one key message here is alcohol is not an eligible expense. You are permitted to use the per diem rates within the travel directive where that makes sense. Some of the other key categories of eligible costs are outlined in the next couple of slides. Any costs claimed must be incurred as part of the project activities, so we may ask you to demonstrate that as part of your claim. Any selling, marketing, or advertising costs, including travel and labor related to those activities, are not eligible. Various smaller categories of spend, for example, software licenses that are new and used directly for the project activities, may be eligible. Also, subscription fees would be reimbursable during the project period, but remember that these costs have to be new to the business. So for example, if you are paying for cloud storage before the project, you may be asked to provide bills to show costs before and after the start of the project to support your claim. Rental space may be reimbursable, productive and lab space, but not admin, as long as it's contracted after the kickoff of the project and wouldn't have been incurred if not for the project. Conference costs, if you were to host a hackathon that contributes directly to your project, that's a good example of an eligible conference cost, but industry conferences and the related travel are generally not eligible. Continuing on, dissemination costs, not marketing costs, are eligible for funding. Honorary costs, where the cost is incurred to support Indigenous participation, may be eligible. Only SMEs may obtain funding for IP and patent costs, and there are limits set up in the finance guide capped at $200,000. If you incur additional, key on the word additional again, cybersecurity costs to support the project, if they are directly related to funding activities, they may be eligible. Payments to federal entities like the NRC, for example, may be reimbursed subject to the Treasury Board guides. In the Project Finance Guide, there is a detailed list of ineligible costs that may not be funded. Key ineligible costs are refundable sales taxes, costs of routine administration and operations, costs unrelated to project objectives, costs already covered by other government funding sources, infrastructure costs or costs related to construction or building purposes. Costs that will not be funded are any in-kind contributions. Only cash costs can be reimbursed. If you are receiving any other government funding that is used towards the eligible costs of this project, so costs that you will be claiming funding for, you will be required to disclose that to NGen. The stacking limit for NGen project is 100%, so you can only utilize government funding up to 100% on the project. However, if you're receiving funding from other government programs and they have a lower stacking limit, say 75%, the lower stacking limit would apply. For example, if you had received funding from the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy, you would need to consider any potential funding from NGen when you're applying, as we would not reconcile those costs for you. It is your obligation to ensure that you claim labor costs correctly without double dipping government funding. A workbook is required for each individual partner. Each partner will need to submit their own workbook and submit it as part of the application. This outlines the partner project budget and is reviewed by NGen for eligibility of costs. We ask that you provide sufficient detail of the proposed expenses so that we're able to assess the eligibility of the costs and the applicability to the project. These finance workbooks will be completed inside of the NGen portal, which we'll go through in just a minute. Once the workbooks are submitted by the intake deadline, we will review and provide feedback to you for your workbooks. This allows you to incorporate that feedback into your workbooks for assessment. If you're successful with the assessment, we'll then do a more detailed review of the workbooks and all of the eligibility pieces, and that will end up representing your project budget and will be outlined in your MPA. Now just a quick view of where you're going to go to enter them. In order to submit the required financial documents, once the project has passed through the initial screening, you'll need to log on to the portal, navigate to the URL you see here, and sign into the portal. As described earlier under Financial Due Diligence, similarly, once logged in, select Project from the menu and choose your specific project from the list. Again, this section will not be available for you to access until you reach the application development stage. See the blue chevron above. Once you select Financials, shown on the menu here, you'll see on the left, right at the top, the Project Finance Workbooks. Click on the highlighted link and the list of cost categories will come up. The first category for data entry is Other Funding, where you will identify for us if you're receiving funds from any other program, like CIF or IRAP. Then you continue on down through each section according to your project costs. To enter data in a cost category, select New on the right side of each bar. You'll have the ability to go back and edit later. A dialog box, like the one above, for labor, will pop up asking for relevant information along with some on-screen guidance similar to what you'll see in this presentation. Each cost category could have more than one entry, more than one labor class or role, more than one piece of equipment, more than one kind of material. So just keep hitting Save and New, or if you're done, just hit Save and it will take you back. Don't worry, until you get through the assessment and submit for final approval, you can always go back and make changes. If you navigate somewhere and want to get back, the back button will always work, or you can take a shortcut by clicking on the orange text to jump to a different view. When all of your costs have been entered, including the amount of funding sought from NGen, you can click the Review Requested button to notify the Finance Director that your financials are ready to be reviewed. The project finance team will review the details of your finance workbook and let you know if there are any eligibility issues with your information or if further clarification is required. Now to speak about our funding process. Claims are made on a reimbursement basis after review and approval of eligible costs at your reimbursement rate. Claims are to be submitted every 3 months and usually paid within 45 days. These dates are stipulated in the MPA. NGen will apply a 15% holdback, the last 15% of the project, until all of the project closeout documents are submitted and approved. We're not just talking finance support, this refers to all of the IP documents, etc. that are monitored throughout the project. NGen reimburses based on claims, and you will submit those to us through a portal. We will talk about that process next. Only eligible project costs as defined by ISED may be claimed for funding from NGen, so again, refer to our guides we just went through. Please note that only expenses incurred after the project start date can be claimed. All claims for reimbursement submitted to NGen require supporting documentation. We work on a cash basis, so only costs that have been incurred and paid within the period may be claimed. Claims will be reviewed alongside project monitoring of your project and its progress towards project deliverables or milestones. So in order to validate your claim submissions, you will need to supply some documentation to support the costs. For example, timesheets reflecting the hours incurred towards the project activities, and copies of invoices over $500. For labor rate support, you will be required to submit payroll registers with your first claims for an individual, and then whenever the rate for that individual changes. Evidence of payment is required only on payments in excess of $250,000, but of course you are still subject to audit on that with the Auditor General and us if we get audited. Please note that you will be required to keep a record of all supporting documentation for at least 7 years after the completion of the project in the case of an audit, which the Government of Canada reserves the right to do. Our finance claims team will reach out to the project lead and partners to set up user registration on the claims portal and provide you with a user guide for it. Note that each organization within the project will be submitting claims for the project costs they have incurred and paid. Your claim will normally be processed within 45 days, providing that all supporting documentation is in order. We ask that you provide as much information or context in the claim as possible to help us understand the claim and make it an easy process for review. The finance team will be trying to link your expenses back to the line item in the finance workbook or a PCR if there's a post-approval budget change. So again, the more detail in your finance workbook and claim, the easier it will be for finance to approve the claim without a question from finance. User guides and webinars can be found in the FAQ section on the top ribbon of the claims portal. This is not the claim submissions training, it's just a sneak peek at what the screen looks like. When you are approved, finance will provide a webinar and training documentation to you to complete your claim submissions. This is a snapshot of some sections within the claim form that clearly outline the level of detail we require on each line item of your claim. There is a section for you to upload all of the attachments and supporting documentation that we outlined before, such as timesheets when it comes to labor, and then invoices over $500 for other expenses. A few tips off the top. Multiple invoices can be uploaded via a zip folder. You don't have to wait to the end of the quarter to load your claims. You only have to wait to the end of the quarter to hit submit button. Do your claims loading weekly or at least monthly so there's no delay in your submission and reimbursement. Provide as much detail as possible, such as the role in the project for labor and how expenses relate to project deliverables. This will assist us with the claims review. Once a claim is returned to you for edits, our feedback can be viewed in the NGen feedback section within each line item in the claim. When a claim is returned to you to address feedback or if it is approved, the portal users will get an automated notification. Enter one line item per invoice. At the end of this claim form, there is a link to download the Finance Claims Certification, and all the claims must attach this form signed by the CFO or VP Finance or their delegate. This person will need to attest to the costs of the claim being directly related to project activities and that only eligible costs have been claimed and claims have been incurred and paid in cash. And it will include any disclosure for any other government funding or subsidies you are receiving that directly relate to the project's eligible costs. This concludes the finance material for this presentation. Once again, the biggest piece of advice I can provide for you is to carefully read the finance guide and ensure your team understands what costs are eligible. Thank you for your time.